Thank you all for tuning in today, and thanks for taking the time to join the show. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Find us on your favorite podcast listening platform or on YouTube at the CyberHub Podcast YouTube channel, where you can find all of our episodes, short, long, of all sizes and kinds. I've got a very special guest today on the show. If you're a lifelong listener of this podcast, meaning over 150 episodes that we've done at CISO Talk, you know Mr. Patrick Gaul. He's the executive director of the National Technology Security Coalition. He's a dear, dear friend of mine, someone who I definitely admire his work because he's trying to get the voice of the CISO heard on the federal government level. He's got a board that represents approximately 90 Fortune 100 CISOs that support his efforts on the Hill, and he's a champion for all of us that are security practitioners. So without further ado, let's go bring Pat into the show. But one last thing, I will be in Israel for April live podcast, April 16th over at Intel Ignite with our friends at Intel and so many others. So you can go check that out at cyberhubpodcast.com. Make sure to get that there. Without further ado, let's start the show. cyberhubpodcast.com, and it's CISO Talk time. Let's go, y'all.
From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're listening to the CISO Talk Podcast. No sales, no bullshit, just straight talk. Straight talk. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
Mr. Patrick Gaul, welcome to the show again.
Hello, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. You're no stranger to the show.
I am not, but it's been far too long.
I think it's been a few years since I've had you on, because I took a year off from the show in 2022, and you know, with a new baby at home, I decided that I was gonna do just one show instead of three. You know,
is that per day or per week?
You know, I do one show 5 times a day, and I do two other shows that are each, you know, once a week. So kind of decided to take some time off. It's now back, and this show's exciting, and I'm glad to have you with us. For our audience who may not be familiar with the NTSC, and I think you heard my introduction, is there anything I missed that they should know about the NTSC?
Let me just one small correction. We have 53 chief information security officers on our board, but we have about 90 senior technology security executives associated with the coalition. Some of them serve on our advisory committee, some serve on our policy committee, and some are just special advisors. But 53 CISOs, but Fortune 1000 companies from across the nation, all big names.
That's I stand corrected. I remember seeing 90 somewhere, and it's probably 90 senior executives and not CISOs. But the NTSC has been a force to reckon with as you guys fight for the voice of the CISO. Pat, I'll kind of kick this off to you. You guys just spent a lot of time. You had your policy meeting in DC with some of our elected representatives. I think a lot of people who tune into the show are always wondering what's, you know, the mixed match of government regulation around security and kind of their view of cyber to the realities of what we encounter in the trenches daily. You want to give our audience a bit of an update on that?
Sure. I mean, this is actually a very exciting time. We had the National Cybersecurity Strategy drop on March 2nd. I happened to be in Washington the morning it dropped and had a number on the Hill that day. Actually got my copy at 5:30 in the morning, so had 3 hours to read it before I went up on the Hill to meet with some of the folks in, you know, Homeland Security, so I could ask them some questions about it. So there's a lot of interest in terms of, you know, the pillars. There's 5 pillars. Critical infrastructure security is certainly an important one, pillar 1, and you know, that'll be the one that'll be most, you know, overseen by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So CISA. Pillar 2 is get after the threat actors. Pillar 3 is shape market forces to drive security and resilience, which is really about pushing the responsibility for, you know, security back into the folks that create software, who manufacture hardware. That's going to be an interesting one to regulate and create. Pillar 4 is invest in a resilient future, and workforce development is in that pillar, and that's something that the NTSC has certainly been focused on for quite a while. I think it's a problem that we've admired for the last decade. We're coming to a critical point where over 50% of our cyber workforce, James, are baby boomers and Generation X. So we're headed for a cliff. And, we need a pipeline of young people, but the gap for most companies today is in the 7 to 9 year experience level. So we've got to figure out a way to keep the young people interested because, for every young person looking for a job just out of university, there's about 5 jobs or 5 people for every job. But if you go up the stack, there's only about 0.5 people for every job. So there's a lot of stuff we have to unpack there and work through. And that's going to be handled by the Office of the National Cyber Director. And I learned last week that there's actually a draft circulating among the federal agencies on a plan to address workforce. And hopefully the private sector folks like myself will see that plan soon. And then last, Pillar 5 is global partnerships. So there's a lot to unpack in that 35-page document. And we spent a lot of time last week in our legislative day talking about it. We had Val Coldfield, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for CISA, spent about 45 minutes with us. We had Nick Learson, who's the Assistant Deputy Director within the Office of the National Cyber Director, responsible for cybersecurity and programs. And he came in and kind of gave us the perspective from, ONCD. So a lot of work there. Meanwhile, there's a ton of stuff going on with privacy. Iowa passed, the legislative body passed, the House passed a privacy bill. I think the vote was 43-0, and that had already been passed by the Senate. So that goes back to the Senate for some procedural issues. Then it'll go to the governor, get signed, and that'll be the 6th state that has a privacy bill. We're headed down the same path we have with data breach notification, James. We're looking at the possibility of having 50 plus privacy bills, which I know, between the chief privacy officers, the chief information security officers, and the chief risk and compliance officers, they're all just thrilled with that concept and that idea. Meanwhile, we've got the CISOs working on the data rulemaking part of the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Director Eastley was on the Hill yesterday meeting with the appropriators. There's a lot of money in that bill, $3 billion in going towards this in the budget. 98 million of that is earmarked just for managing the amount of information that CISA expects to get under this incident reporting bill. And there's a ton of stuff they're going to have to be able to do to process that information, discern the intelligence in that information, connect the dots, and send it back out to the private sector in near real time. But that's not happening today unless you're in the JCDC. If you're in the JCDC, you're getting some pretty good information. But as we learned last week, if you're not in the JCDC, cyber incident or cyber threat intelligence sharing has not advanced dramatically in the last several years. In fact, we
for
had
audience, real quick, Pat, for audience members who may not know what the JCDC is, what is that?
It's the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, and it's an organization that Jen Easterly, Director Easterly, put together in response to SolarWinds and Log4j. And it was initially intended to be, I think, like a rapid incident reporting on a national level. It has evolved into something a lot more dramatic, focused on incident reporting. A lot of companies like CrowdStrike and Microsoft and Palo Alto collaborating and sharing information, but you have to be on the inside as a private sector company to get that information right now. I think Director Easley's idea is to leverage that relationship and eventually push that out to more companies. But right now, we did a session last week, and it was, you remember when Ronald Reagan was debating, I can't remember who it was, but he asked, I think it was Jimmy Carter. He said, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? And Jimmy Carter had to say no. So when, cyber threat intelligence, are we better off than we were, 4 years ago? And we're not. And we've been doing this for 7 years, and it's constantly been a real problem. So that's going to go through rulemaking. Director Easley expects to have the proposed rules out by March of next year. That will go through a commentary period. And then the idea was the implementation will happen in September of 2025. So we're a long ways away from having that bill be,
our adversaries don't wait this long to come after us, right? They're after us every single day. Is there any hope in sight to see government maybe grease their wheels, maybe some WD-40 to get it to move a bit faster?
Well, we're in an interesting political environment.
Yes, we
climate. Every time I go on the Hill, and no matter which side of the aisle I talk to, when we talk about cybersecurity, everybody says we're bipartisan. We're bipartisan, and but let's see if they walk the talk when it comes time to start appropriating money, investing in the things we need to invest in, especially workforce. That ought to be a bipartisan issue, but I'm not sure what's going to happen in this session. And then we're going to be entering a presidential race next year, and a lot of things aren't going to get done. So I don't, for example, the cybersecurity strategy, I don't see a lot of that getting implemented in the next 18 months.
So is this document even relevant, right? Because one of the things I was reading something in the Washington Post earlier this week. I think it was in the Washington Post 202, kind of their cyber newsletter. Yeah. And they were talking about the desire to create a U.S. cyber force. That's correct. The desire to create, there was an open letter penned by multiple, 4-star generals and a lot of folks over at the Pentagon saying it's time to unify all of the DoD cyber efforts under one and established a 7th branch of the military called U.S. Cyber Force. And there's very little appetite. Like Space Force, you and I, we witnessed the establishment of Space Force very, very quickly because it had presidential support. Here they're saying that there isn't some. Do you think Congress could push potentially a 7th branch? Do you think a U.S. cyber force is actually good for
Well, I didn't read the article, and I wonder how it bounces against U.S. Cyber Command, which is a joint group.
So it's kind of like organizing Cyber Command, but Cyber Command, rather than it being almost kind of like a Army/NSA type of tool, it'd rather be a U.S. cyber force. And then the concept behind that is also recruiting soldiers for cyber force. So you enter the 7th branch of government, where if you're in cyber, you and I are military vets. So we went through PT requirements. But if you're in cyber force, you may not need the same type of PT requirements that you would if you enlisted in the Army and wanted to become Cyber Command. There's no difference whether you wanted to be a cyber officer in the military, a SIGNET. There's no PT difference between that and, let's say, an 11 Bravo. You've got to have the same physical condition.
Yeah, no, I don't see any appetite for that. And right now, all of the armed forces are struggling to recruit. They're all missing their recruiting goals on a quarterly basis. And whether you're offering them positions in cyber or, 0311 grunts, they're just not signing up right now. Kids aren't going into the military. And so now I don't see an appetite for that. I think they're still trying to figure out, balances between, federal agencies and some of the regulations they're creating around things. And, my goal would be to have a national cyber scholarship for service program, James. And I've been promoting this for 2 years in Congress. And for the first time, I'm starting to get some feedback from people that saying, that's an interesting idea. Tell me more about it. We have Cyber Corps for Service, which is an amazing program. It's graduated 4,000 students in 20 years. It's underfunded. There's only about 120 colleges, maybe 7 community colleges involved in that. Staying on workforce for a second. There's a lot of, what Microsoft is doing with the community colleges is great. Right. There's some wonderful things going on with HBCUs, but they're all disparate efforts. And so what we need and what the National Cybersecurity Strategy document called for. It said we need a national strategy around fixing the cyber workforce problem. For the past 3 years, I've been pounding on the doors in Congress saying we need two things. We need a national strategy, and we need more diversity in the workforce. You know, the 24% are women. You go into minorities, that drops dramatically. I think 15 Fortune 1000 CISOs are women. It's a big problem. So I don't know that, I don't think it's a bad idea. I just don't know that there's an appetite in Congress, given the current, budget discussions and debt ceiling discussions and oversight, and over the fact that CISA is getting $30 billion. There's going to be a lot of oversight from the House on that money. And like I said, Jen Easterly was with the appropriators yesterday, got asked a lot of hard questions about where that money's going, because it is a lot of money, and they want to make sure that the taxpayers getting their bang for the buck.
I wish they'd do the same with Ukraine money, because I'm less concerned about how Jen Easterly spends my tax dollars than I am with Ukraine.
I'm not sure I want to go there, but
we're not going there. That's a personal James opinion. That's my personal opinion at all. Yeah. Seeing her being grilled for it a bit upsets me, because she should be focused on strategy. I mean, not saying she shouldn't be answering to appropriation, right? But Jen's been I thought a unifier and one of the better leaders that we've had on the CISA side. Granted, we've only had about less than a handful since its establishment.
If you think of MPPD, the National Protections and Programs Directorate, which was the predecessor to CISA, which
Right.
Chris Krebs took over and initially, evolved into CISA. And then, he had his situation with President Trump, and, he ended up leaving, and then Jen came in, and she's done an amazing job. We talk a lot about the public-private partnership. I'm not sure that that's as much of a reality as people think. And we talk a lot about, other terms, but when we think about incident reporting, cyber incident reporting today, the challenge is that, you got to have trust to start out with before you can have collaboration, and then collaboration leads to, beneficial actions. I'm not sure the trust exists today. Most corporations, not necessarily willing to open the kimono and share everything that's going on. Even if the CISO thinks, I got to share this, he or she still has to go through legal, and there's a lot of challenges to getting to the point where we are truly exchanging information the way we need to. So, just think about incident reporting for a second. You've got the bill, the CISA is pushing through rulemaking. Meanwhile, the SEC is going to come out, I think it's April 23rd, 25th, is going to come out with their proposed rule.
Correct.
And right now, according to everything I'm hearing, incident reporting is still in there, and it doesn't align with CISA. Now, I've talked to Admiral Montgomery, former executive director of Cyberspace Flare Commission. I know he's encouraging the SEC to remove the incident reporting piece and to resonate on CISA. Let CISA be the centralized, point of view. And if we end up with 72 hours or 24 hours, we still have to define, what is an event, what is an incident, what is material, James, under the SEC, what is material? And if you go and read, I think this is, you can fact check me on this. I think it has to do with something like 20+% of pre-tax revenue for it to be material. And if that's true, then we've never actually had a material breach, Target, Equifax, none of those were material. So there's a lot of definitions that need to be refined. And then we all understand what an incident is and when you have to report it and how much you have to report. But the idea is you have to report, tons of information within 24 hours. under the SEC rule, or 3 hours in India. It's just insane. I mean, the forensics haven't even begun. So you got the SEC, the FCC is also looking at incident reporting, and so is the FTC. So you have all of these independent federal agencies who have the ability to create their own regulations. So where is the harmonization going to come in? And in the national strategy, they talk about harmonization. They talk about, I forget the office, cyber, some new group that's going to set up, that's going to be pushing for harmonization. And Jen talked about that yesterday as well. But we can't have multiple incident reporting bills and regulations. That would be insanity, and would just drive the private sector nuts. So hopefully they'll get all of that harmonized. And meanwhile, and that's the federal level. We haven't even talked about the fact that we have 50 states plus 4 territories with their own cyber incident notification requirements. So if you have a breach, you have to notify. You're a multinational corporation. You're all over the country. You have a breach, you have to deal with the AGs in every one of those states. And while a lot of the bills are similar, there are nuances that you have to be aware of, and that requires compliance. And compliance requires money, and it takes resources away that could be focused on cybersecurity. And this whole regulatory, can you regulate a company into security? I don't think so.
I haven't seen one government regulation globally to stop a cybersecurity breach, incident, event, or otherwise.
Are we going to regulate? I mean, this is an off-the-cuff comment. Are we going to regulate ourselves into stopping school shootings?
Yeah, I mean,
you don't have to go there, but
I agree with you. I think, there's an effort. There's an effort that I think is there's an effort being done to try and, I want to say, add more regulation, because we all think that regulation solves problems. But regulation is oversight. And one of my challenges, I did a 30-minute podcast alone, kind of with my take on the national cybersecurity strategy after it dropped. And I spent, I think it was 20 minutes on the fact that we're talking about more regulation, and rather than talking about the private-public collaborative. And there's other countries in the world where you see that being very, very, the private-public partnership being very, very effective. UK is one of them, right? Israel's another. I believe Germany is up there as well. Switzerland's up there. There's countries out there that have shown the private-public model to be better than regulation, right? And there's a need for that. You said one key word there, which is trust. And I can tell you that I trust my federal partners. I don't have to agree with the agency as a whole to trust the people that support me in doing my role effectively, right? Like my partners at the FBI or Secret Service or CISA, they're not political to me. They're my partners. They represent something that's supposed to be helpful. And I think that's something Jen was able to kind of get across her team. And I know there's, depending on what paper you read or what website you look at, you hear a lot of stuff around the FBI, but every person I've ever met in the FBI and the cybersecurity team has been phenomenal in their support of everything we try to do as practitioners.
Director Easterly has been criticized recently in the recent past for being a rock star at being at all of these, DEFCON, Black Hat, right. RSA, the place Aspen, but you think back 7 years ago, MPPD, before Chris Krebs got in there, they never collaborated. They never interacted with the private sector. And now Jen's got all these regional offices, building relationships with the local community, being a resource to the local community. We have one here in Atlanta. I've met with some folks. We've tried to bring those folks into our regional roundtables so they can talk about the resources they have and what they can do to help.
And the amount of free tools that CISO drops, the amount of free tools that your cyber team is able to use is magnificent.
It is. They need to do a little work around the language. And we had this conversation last week with Val Cofield, the chief strategy officer there. It's good stuff, but if you're a small business, most of these folks don't know what red team, blue team is. So they've got to simplify the language, dumb it down a bit so it speaks more directly to the small business. But these regional offices, yes, they build relationships with multinational corporations, transnational corporations, but where they really are at value added is, the small businesses are able to come in and get some, direct conversations and learn a bit more about how they can secure themselves. Because right now, small businesses are getting killed. They are resource poor and target rich. And, small hospitals, regional hospitals are getting killed. Healthcare is getting murdered.
Yeah.
Water authorities are, in desperate need of more support. So, most, I don't think JP Morgan Chase is getting a lot of interaction with the regional office. I don't know that they need it, but, the local regional hospital does, because they don't have the resources. They don't have the money to invest in cybersecurity. And I told you about a study recently that was done by ESI Thought Lab. And going back to regulation, the two most regulated industries, I think, in the United States are probably healthcare and financial, two of the most, right? And yet this study determined that, in fact, they don't rank very high against some of the unregulated agencies like tech, automotive, manufacturing, which you traditionally wouldn't think were very secure. But across all of the cybersecurity elements that the ESI Thought Lab analyzed, financial services only rated number one in one area, and that was the plan to invest more money. And healthcare fell well down. So, there's, it goes back to regulation. These are heavily regulated industries. HIPAA's been around a long time. So can we spend a few minutes talking about privacy?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
So 6 states have passed privacy legislation so far. California, which is really their CCPA 2.0, and it's called the California Privacy Rights Act. That went into effect on 1st of January. And what else? Virginia went into effect the 1st of January. Connecticut and Colorado go into effect the 1st of July, and then Utah goes into effect December of this year. So those were the first 5 states, and then Iowa, once the bill gets finalized, we'll know when it's going to go into effect, but I would think later this year. Meanwhile, last year, the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce within the House Committee on Homeland Security, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, produced the ADPPA, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, American Data Privacy and Protection Act. And that passed out of the subcommittee. I think the vote was 53-2, extremely bipartisan bill. And but it never got to the House floor. I think 2 reasons. Speaker Pelosi is from California, and the California caucus is pretty strong in the House on the Democratic side, and CCPA and this new bill, which was due to come out, there's just no appetite to put it forward. And then the other side of that was Senator Cantwell, who's the chair of the Senate Committee on Energy and Commerce, said that she would never put it on the floor in the Senate. And she had 2 primary objections. She didn't feel the private right to action went far enough. And and she felt like it didn't go far enough to regulate data brokers. Both valid points, I think, but this is where compromise comes in. This bill passed the subcommittee 53-2, if I remember correctly, and while it's not perfect, it's the closest thing we've seen to a federal privacy legislation that actually works in ever. And so we met with the chief counsel for the on the Republican side for the subcommittee, and to talk about ADPPA. And I think you'll see that reemerge. And in fact, the NTSC
is there an appetite for it in this session or this year to bring it to the floor? And if so,
I think there's an appetite for a federal privacy legislation. I think everybody recognizes that it's insanity to go down the same path we went down with data breach. The challenge is going to be, okay, I think it'll get on the House floor. I think it could pass the House because it's now controlled by the Republicans, right? And
Kevin McCarthy is still from California, though.
Right. And that's going to be a challenge. But let's say we get the compromises we need on private right to action. Interestingly enough, CCPA doesn't have private right to action, or the California Privacy Rights Act. But this bill did have private right to action. Now, it wouldn't kick in until 2 years after the bill went into effect. And there were a lot of restrictions around it. So it wasn't perfect, but it was in there. And it didn't go far enough to regulate data brokers, especially in this truly political climate with abortion laws popping up and law enforcement wanting to get access to health records. And, I don't think anybody wants that to happen. But that aside, if we get it through the House, then it's going to have the same barrier to Senate, and that's Senator Cantwell. So I don't know what it's going to take to get Senator Cantwell to accept it, but we're going to be working hard in partnership with our, the members of Congress we have been working with. We had Congressman Swalwell, who is the
Congressman from California, formerly of the House Intelligence Committee. Formerly, he's been kicked off that committee.
But he's also he's the ranking member on the subcommittee on cybersecurity and infrastructure protection. And we had him in last week, and we talked to him about this. And his point was, look, I understand why industry wants a federal mandate. I understand the angst that all of these bills are going to create. And, there's a cascading effect. You've got to be compliant. Compliant is costly. I mean, I talked to one CISO, global CISO at a very large bank, and they spend $2 million a year just on staying compliant with all of the regulations that they have to be compliant with. And, while compliant firms get hacked a whole lot less than non-compliant firms, the reality is compliance doesn't equal security. And we've talked about that issue before. So, his point was, we think California is the model. And I don't know, maybe what do we do? A lot of companies are just resonating on GDPR. Yeah, GDPR, Global Data Protection Act.
Yeah, the European Data Protection Act.
Yeah, regulation. And GDPR. A lot of transnational companies, that's their foundation.
Well, because that was the first one that came through, right? GDPR was the first one to come through the door. I recall 5 years ago, I started the podcast around the time GDPR was getting enforced. If one of my first episodes, I remember I had a guest on the show, and we talked about, how useless GDPR really is to prevent data breaches, and how much cost it added to companies to comply with it, and increase the cost of doing business, obviously, for a lot of them. And so, GDPR, while it's the style, it's become fairly standard. I don't think it's the right solution for America. I think Americans are very different from Europeans. You and I know this, having spent time on the other side of the pond. We very much well know that that privacy there is very different from privacy here. Ask an American what privacy is, he's going to give you something completely different. Ask a European what privacy is, and it depends which European you're asking. I mean, so
Yeah.
it's
The other thing about ADPPA, which we're uncomfortable with, is the section in the bill where they invest a significant amount of money and additional lawyers into the FTC.
We need less lawyers in the FTC. We need less people in the federal government, period. But that's you know, I think, the work the NTSC is doing on the Hill is to get this across so that people can at least if it goes to the floor and gets voted, whether it gets passed or not, at least we know where our areas of opportunities are, right? If it fails to pass the Senate for whatever reason, because it doesn't regulate data brokers enough, because it calls for more FTC lawyers, right? And those are, at least we know where to go back and have the sponsors of the bill go back and make some adjustments, take it through subcommittee and get it back on the floor. But it'd be disastrous if we went through 50 privacy bills in this country.
It would. And look, it didn't come out of that subcommittee last year without a lot of compromise. And you and I have talked about the lack of compromise, the lack of sitting down and finding out where we agree and working on those issues that we agree on. We don't have to agree on everything, and we're never going to agree on everything. And I'm this collective we, right? Republicans, Democrats, Independents. We're never going to agree on everything, but we ought to be able to find those nuggets from
yeah,
and advance things. In workforce development, addressing the cyber workforce challenge is something we all ought to agree on, because China's not got a problem with workforce. North Korea doesn't. Russia doesn't. They don't have a problem with getting people.
You've named 3 communist nations where their people have no rights. So
well, that's true, but that's the reality.
I mean, North Dakota just passed the first cybersecurity bill requiring cybersecurity education in K through 12 schools.
Who did that?
The state of North Dakota. So 17 and a half people and about 30 buffaloes and 100 eagles can now go study cybersecurity. It took him 8 years to pass this bill.
There are pockets of enlightenment, I call it. When Georgia elected this, that you can take a coding class or a class of that nature, a programming class, coding class, and that was substitute for a foreign language credit in high school. That's a good move forward. They're doing some amazing things in Texas, especially around Austin and school districts. We've got some high schools up around Augusta that have, 4-year cyber high school curriculums, and they're doing the same thing in Texas, and that's what we need.
Yeah, but we need that across the entire nation. We need K through the way we solve our workforce development, the way we solve our lack of recruiting in the military, the way we solve a lot of the challenges we encounter today is by really going to the schools and getting people interested in it early on, right? You get I've got a ton of books around quantum computing that are toddler books for my son, and around mechanics and engineering. Why? Because that's what I want him to be interested in, right? So that's the toys we buy, that's the books we read, that's the stuff we go into, because at a very young age, I can mold his mind to go towards that type of work, and that type of develop that passion, because no one knows what they're really born to do. At 18, none of us know what we want to be either. So, going to college for 4 years and trying to figure that out is just a challenge all of within itself. And it's unnecessary pressure on a lot of people at the age of 18. Because I guarantee you, when you and I were enlisted at 18 and someone said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And you're like, I don't grow up. I don't know.
I was 17 and
I was 17 when I enlisted.
Yeah, when I went in the Marine Corps, and when I got to Parris Island, it didn't matter what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. They told me what I wanted to be and do, and for the next 9 years, that worked out well for me. But I was one of those kids who needed that structure and discipline in order to mature, and not all kids need that, but for some kids, it's a pretty good thing. And there's some real, opportunity in the military for, getting into a cyber curriculum, and, kids should be looking at that if they don't know what they want to do. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we've talked about recently. I talked about the cyber threat intelligence. I talked about privacy. The other thing that's going to come out, and we can touch on this just quickly, when the SEC rule comes out, there's a whole new subcommittee within the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee, which is this committee of 35 executives that support Director Easterly. We just named 14 more last week. I think they originally set it up at 21, and then they just added the last 14 last week. And there's a subcommittee called Corporate Cyber Responsibility, and headed up by Dave DeWalt. And that subcommittee is focused on trying to understand how we can make corporate boards more cyber aware, help understand, because the SEC rule is going to impose some pretty significant responsibility, fiduciary responsibility on corporate board members. And not going to be able to ignore cybersecurity going forward. They're going to have to be really interested in it. But are they prepared to be interested in it? One of my national sponsors is a company called Proofpoint, and their global CISO, global resident CISO, is a woman by the name of Lucia Malika, just a brilliant lady. And, she spends a lot of time working with corporate boards. They have a whole program educating corporate boards. There's a lot of work to be done to get all of our corporate boards up to speed on this. And, it's an issue that I think, it's going to be really important in the next 18 months after the rule comes out.
All right. I know we're almost at time. I'm going to put you on the hot seat.
Can I say one last thing before?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
I just wanted to mention that today is National Vietnam Veterans Day. And I just wanted to say to all my brothers who served, Semper Fi.
Semper Fi, indeed. I'm going to now, Mr. Marine, I'm putting you on the. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right. Buzzword you'd love to bury in our buzzword graveyard.
Whole of a nation. I'm so tired of hearing it. It doesn't exist. It's never going to exist.
Okay, we'll take it. What's the last song you listened to for coming on the show, Pat?
I've been listening to, you can see all my albums back here. I'm listening to Linda Ronstadt's Greatest Hits. I was listening to it this morning.
I love it. What's the book you're reading right now or listening to? I think you're a book reader rather than an audio.
I'm reading Fixing American Cybersecurity. It's a book that was orchestrated by Larry Clinton. There's a lot of contributors to it, but Larry Clinton's the editor of the book. Mm-hmm. He's the president of the Internet Security Alliance.
Yep.
This is, in some sense, a fairly controversial book in talking about regulation. A lot of proposals for change. I highly recommend anybody who's interested in the future of cybersecurity in America to read this book.
I will be ordering it off of Amazon. It'll be my book to read on my flight next week. So love that. Mr. Patrick Gaul, ntsc.org, correct? That's the website?
ntsc.org or patrick@ntsc.org.
If you're a CISO and you're interested in getting involved or at least learning more about the NTSC, you can reach out to Patrick. The NTSC is an amazing organization, a great collaboration for CISOs, and a definite great opportunity to have your voice heard. Patrick, on behalf of myself, and everyone on the show, thank you for coming on and continued success with the NTSC and everything you guys are doing. It's really valuable work for a lot of us in this industry.
James, it's always good to connect with you, and looking forward to finding some time and after you get back from Israel and catching up face to face.
I can't wait. Thanks, y'all, for tuning in. Please make sure to subscribe to the latest and catch all the latest CISO Talk podcast episodes. Season 3 is just about wrapped up here. We'll be coming back with Season 4 in August of this year with some really, really awesome guests I can't wait to share. So tune into that. Till then, have a great rest of your day. And most importantly, y'all stay cyber safe.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. and get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.